Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this pre-Q&A for Mogwai Plays Atomic at the Holland Festival. My name is Dana Linsen. I'm a film critic from the Netherlands, and I will be moderating this Q&A. But first of all, I have to introduce my guests. Next to me is Mark Cousins, filmmaker and the director of Atomic. Yes, please give him a warm applause. And then on the left side of the table for you is Stuart Braithwaite, from the guitarist and singer from Mogwai, who's also the spokesperson for this project. No, you're not going to say a word now that I said this? Okay. It's always a bit tricky to talk about something before you're going to see it, because we're not want to spoil the fun. But of course you all know that, hence since the title is Atomic, that it's about the atomic age. And actually I wanted to start asking you a question, because everybody, depending on their age, has their own like personal associations with what is atomic and what is the atomic age and what is atomic energy, etc., etc. So what were your first like associations with atomic, even before the project, maybe even like 10 years ago? What does atomic stand for?
Well, yeah, I grew up and still live in Scotland, and in Scotland, about 40 miles from where I live at the present, which isn't far from where I grew up, there's the Trident nuclear base. So growing up in the 80s, as a child in the 80s, there was always a feeling that we were close to something really terrible happening. And also with things like the Chernobyl power plant disaster and these things, there was always just a general feeling of dread anyway, because of the Thatcher government. But the fear of nuclear annihilation because of Ronald Reagan and that era, so it was all bad.
All bad, all scary. Mark, how was that for you?
Yeah, pretty much the same. I'm old enough to have had those nightmares about the atomic age. So if you're of a certain age, we had them, and it shows you how much this threat, this fear that Stuart's talking about, wasn't only at a social and political level. It went into our unconscious, and partly because of the government information films that tried to scare us, etc. There was this sense of anxiety, a kind of background noise, a kind of drone in our lives through those years, and so that's my first association.
So when the idea came up to, well, actually it was a commissioned film by the BBC for 70 years of the bombings of Hiroshima, but then they approached the band first. So what was your first reaction? Like, yay, atomic?
Yeah. I mean, it just there had already been a series of films with some other musicians contributing to archive films. King Creosote did one about Scotland. Jarvis Cocker did one about the Sheffield steel industry. We just thought they'd been great projects, and the atomic era was something close to our hearts, because we'd played a concert in Hiroshima. It was in 2003, and visited the Peace Park, seen the devastation, seen the letters that the mayor of Hiroshima had written to every country that had nuclear weapons, begging them to stop. And our music's kind of grim, so we were thinking, this is going to work. And and then when they got Mark involved, it was great working with Mark too. So yeah, it was just all positive, apart from the subject matter.
I understood that Mogwai always wanted to work with Mark on something. So was it the band's idea to approach him, or how did that happen?
I don't know how it happened.
I don't know how it happened either. It was like a shotgun wedding. To make a film, the prospect of making a film on this subject, I had made other films using archive footage, already existing footage. And the idea here was not to shoot any new footage, not to do any interviews, not to travel to another country to film what anything about their current nuclear program was. In other words, to look backwards. And so it looked to me that this was a great chance to make a film about how memories well up. Thank you very much. How the memory of the nuclear age welled up. And cinema is great at that memory. Cinema is great at sort of magic and myth and fear and dreamscapes. Think of the films of David Lynch, etc. Those films are extremely cinematic. And this was a chance to comb through all the old archive footage, all the old movies footage from the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. and see the buried, submerged fear in that footage. So some of you will know the Godzilla films that came out of Japan after the atrocity of Hiroshima, and they were a direct result, in a way, of the bombing. You know, those films, even though they were very popular in many ways, they made it clear that something had been unleashed, something buried had been unleashed by this atrocity, and so cinema is good at that kind of stuff. And so the idea of making a film on that was great. And then working, of course, with Mogwai was like, how you couldn't not. Yeah, I'd been a fan of them for so long that it was fantastic.
So we'll get to that into more detail in a second. But when you say the Godzilla films from Japan were about something being unleashed from that atomic power, what did you unleash from the archive, and which archives did you search?
Yeah, I think there's a danger when you think of the idea of the atom, not weaponry or war, but when you think of the idea of atom, you have to acknowledge, I think, that the idea is sublime. The fact that this table is made of, has got a universe within it, a cosmos within it. This glass of wine has a cosmos within it. It's such a beautiful idea. So my first thought was to try and make a film which you're about to see, which has got a sense of paradise, as well as then Paradise Lost, when we saw how we misused the energy in everyday objects in order to, again, make yet more weaponry, as if we did not have enough weapons already in the world. So it was important for me to try and make a film that visually had a sense of paradise, and then Paradise Lost, because of Chernobyl, because of Fukushima, etc. You know, and you want to make a film that moves in a way through different registers. The film you're about to see has no commentary, has no story, as it were, but it has movement within it, thanks to the great music and thanks to shifts in tone, as you're about to see, hopefully. I think that's true, isn't it? There's a sense of, oh, now we've moved on to something else, another world, another tone, another idea about what the atom is, and that's where the filmmaking comes in a way, I think.
So how do you structure when you say there's no story, there's no narration?
Sounds great, doesn't it? Yeah. When I watch a film, I want to feel as if the filmmaker's holding my hand and saying, come with me, let me show you a story, let me show you a world, let me take you into this forest. But then I want the filmmaker or the musician or the writer to let go of my hand, so I feel lost in a way on my own. But they have to be close by, and then they'll take my hand again. And so in the film Atomic, what you'll find is there are sequences. None of the sequences have any explanation, but you can tell what they're about. So it opens with a kind of sense of optimism, almost, you could say, and then it's almost like we step over a threshold from something which is about the great qualities of the atomic world into something much more iniquitous or frankly evil. And so I think the footage and the way it's edited shows that I take your hand again and say, okay, now we're going into the darkest bit of the forest here, and the music does that even better, I think, than the imagery.
So Stuart, do you think the music became the structuring element?
No, I think that the music is, like Mark says, guides you through it, and is the kind of the glue in a certain kind of way, but we were conscious of what Mark was doing, of what each section was. And it was a process. Not everything worked. I mean, there was points where Mark was saying, we don't have something for this section, we don't have something, and we had to actually kind of go and think about it and think, well, how can we reflect this? How can we augment what is happening here? And yeah, I think it was a reciprocal process.
And what you'll see is that the music isn't in any way literal. For example, there's a Hiroshima sequence, and you might expect the music to be extremely tumultuous and aggressive like a storm, and in fact you'll see that something like the opposite happened. And when we were editing, we used a lot of Mogwai's previous already existing music in order to structure the film. We also used other pieces of music. We used some Wagner at one point in order to structure it, to sort of sketch, as it were. And we used the word sketch, didn't we, when we toed and froed between image and music. And I find when you do a film like this and working with great musicians, often when you're making a film, the imagery wants to be like music. It wants to have that shape, that flow of music. And often musicians are often fascinated by film. You know, you're a big film buff, and musicians are fascinated by film. And often they want their music to have a kind of cinematic or narrative almost quality. So there's a kind of desirous relationship between the image and the sound, and that's really exciting. You know, you can do something that I can't, and I can do something that you can't, and the combination, you can feel, hopefully, if it works, it's like the sparks between two terminals in a battery. You hope that a spark will jump.
Well, it does, Stuart. But Mogwai made soundtracks before for films. So, in which way was this different? Because you were working back and forth.
Yeah, I think this was. We've not done a lot of film, and the processes have been very different. The very first one we did for Douglas Gordon and Philippe Perron's Zidane film, they let us do anything. And that was great, but that's not realistic. And then when we did the soundtrack for the French television program Le Revenant, they didn't let us do everything. And that's fine too. And this was somewhere in the middle. Like, Mark let us express ourselves, but he also knew what he wanted. And to be honest, that's a good way of working. It's better than being left to paint the walls with shite or to, I don't know, be working to order, you know?
What a
Not
beautiful turn of phrase he has.
You know what I
Paint
mean.
the wall.
So when we think about the imagery of the atomic age, I think most people will immediately think of the mushroom-shaped cloud. But what is the first sound that comes to mind when you think about the atomic age?
Personally, I think of the sort of futuristic idea of the 70s, and we actually used the instrumentation of that quite a lot. I mean, I also think very strongly of the Kraftwerk Radioactivity record, and that kind of synthesizers that at the time just must have sounded like no one had ever heard anything like it, and weirdly still sound like the future, even though they're from our childhood. So that's the idea for me of that kind of period of time.
What did you hear when you were?
Yeah, I think that for me it was almost silence. You know, the thing about an awful lot of people, like nearly 250,000 people died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the number of people who died after Chernobyl is appalling, etc. So one of the things you could say is the sound is a prayer for the dead. It should be a kind of silence or a minimalism, or, you know, there's that phrase, the nuclear wind. So you could almost say like the sound of wind would be a good sound. So it's not something as a Sturm und Drang, you know, it's not a storm thing. I think that the sound for me is a kind of tinkle almost, you know. At one point, I don't know if you can hear that, but there's that in the film, and that kind of a kind of Zen-like thing, I think, is part of the sound that we wanted to have.
So you were talking before, Mark, about Paradise Lost.
Yes.
Is there also a Paradise Regained
Yes,
in the film?
yes. We don't want to give away the ending, of
No.
course, but just as I was saying earlier, that you want movement within the film. You want your hand held and then let go. You want to feel as if there's a progression. Then in this one, there's a progression also.
Because also when you think about these kind of themes, then there's also the sense of that music actually can help create that catharsis, and especially kind of repetitive and droning music such as Mogwai makes sort of gets you. No, I mean this in a very positive
Repetitive
way.
and droning.
Gets you in
That's
this
fair comment.
heightened state. So do you feel that you were trying to work to that, something that goes beyond the imagery?
Yeah, I think this also goes along with some of the other relationships we've had with filmmakers. Sometimes filmmakers can almost want you to show off. They can want the music to be the center of the attention when it shouldn't be the case, especially with a film like this that's so important, and what you're witnessing is huge things that have destroyed lives, destroyed countries, destroyed cultures. It's not about us. So in a way, we wanted it. We wanted what we did to just be a sort of a bed, you know, which has made it really interesting to do live. It's been the process of learning the music to play live and then playing it has been really interesting and really different from anything we've done. People expecting it to be a normal concert, I think, have probably been quite surprised, because it isn't. It's never pretended to be. But yeah.
And when you say it's not about us, like when you played it in Hiroshima, you played behind the screen. I know
Yeah.
that was for a specific reason,
Yeah.
but you were invisible and you were
Yeah.
quite happy with that. Is that right?
Yeah, when we played the film in Hiroshima, it was one of the most intense experiences.
That was recently, wasn't it? Just
Yeah,
like
it was last week.
last week.
And it was incredibly intense. And we felt we had to speak to the audience before, and there's a real language barrier. Very few people in Japan speak English, so through a translator explain the origins of the project, our reason for being involved, having been to Hiroshima, apologise for playing behind the screen. But I think that people seemed really, after the concert, someone actually asked if we would come and play Nagasaki, which wasn't something I expected. So it's been great. It's been a wonderful and very, very different experience.
Because Mark, you've been with the film in
Chernobyl.
Chernobyl.
Yeah.
So
We played it in Slavutic, which is the city near Chernobyl where the survivors of Chernobyl now live, and the workers, the many people work in Chernobyl. And I was, of course, very worried at how it went down, just like, I guess, playing it in Hiroshima. But what came across from the screening, there were many people there, and what people seem to like in the film is the fact that it wasn't only a tragedy. What you're about to see is not only a tragic story, as we mentioned earlier. They liked this idea of paradise, a kind of toxic paradise in a way, because in Chernobyl now, have any of you been to Chernobyl? No. In Chernobyl now, it's like a garden. Now that there are no human beings there, now there are no predators, there are loads more wild animals than ever before. The flora, the trees, it's extraordinarily beautiful, these cities around there. And that idea, there's a lovely phrase from Saint-Just who said, the present order is the disorder of the future. And that's what you've got in Chernobyl. You know, now that we fucked up and we did this terrible thing there, and now we have cleared off, the place is sort of returning to some new kind of toxic ecosystem. And so that chimed, I think, with the people of Chernobyl, which we were obviously very pleased at.
So in what way is the film and the music also something that's not about, okay guys, we fucked up, but it's also a warning? Or in what way is it also political?
I mean, personally, when you see the magnitude of some of the achievements, and you see that there's a fork in the road, that people can choose to use these amazing discoveries to help people or to gain power and destroy lives, and I think there's it's not spelled out, because as Mark said, it's just there for you to experience. But I think that there is a very obvious moral choice in the film.
And I think, like in America, the National Rifle Association says everybody needs a gun to defend themselves. I think it's a bad argument about the idea of defense. So we don't need nuclear weapons to defend ourselves. If somebody wants to commit a crime, they're going to do it anyway. And so I think we are both unilateralists. We are ashamed and disgraced that there are nuclear weapons on our soil where we live. And so it's political in that sense. It's political in another sense, I think, also in that there's a sequence in the film about the health benefits of atomic research, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, all these things. And so we would both think that government should shift the money they put in nuclear weapons into health and social health research in order that we can improve the lives of our citizens rather than have this background noise hanging over them.
And I mean, we've been talking about nuclear weapons, but there's also nuclear energy, and that's still very present in the world today. So how is that a part of the film?
Well, you're about to see, of course. My personal opinion is I think that there should be I think there should be no fission nuclear reactors, but I think the jury, for me at least, is out on fusion. I think that could potentially be a safe form, but I don't know. I'm not a scientist.
And how's that for you, Stuart, coming from Scotland and living so close to either power plants or the port where they have the submarines?
Yeah, well, I'm very against nuclear weapons, and just the amount of money spent on them just appalls me. I worry greatly about nuclear power, but Mark's actually far more scientific than I, even though he's, I'm sure, been very humble about it. So I couldn't particularly go into the details. But certainly, having watched the film now, probably almost as many times as I've seen Star Wars, which is quite a lot. There's a lot of things in it that worry me.
You work with the film when you play the music live. Are you still surprised by some of the images, or
yeah.
do you keep? What's the last thing you discovered in the film?
I've discovered countless things in the film, but I mean, certain things have become even more chilling and even more. Like, there's stories in it. There's people telling their story, and some of the stories, it's like anything. It's like reading an article or reading the news. Sometimes you can skim over it and it goes in, but you don't. It doesn't really sink in. And some of the things in this film have become so profound, having seen them over and over, like I'm sure Mark did, doing the research and the editing.
There's a Ukrainian woman whose son died in Chernobyl, and she said, "I wish I had the wings to fly to see my dead son." It's just so moving, isn't it? Yeah. It's just so moving. I wish I had the wings to. Ukrainians speak it very poetically, and the ones that I've met, but I just, each time, sometimes there are things that you think if you've seen it again and again, the emotions will lessen, but they don't sometimes.
I think even though we have 1 minute left, but maybe we should fly away with these words, because I don't think I can ask another question after this. And also, well, we're gonna fly with you guys with the film and the music tonight. So thank you, Stuart and Mark, for being here with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got more wine.
And now we're going to sign our peace treaty.
Thank you, everyone.